Hello friends, welcome to the channel IT Simplified. In today's video, I'm here to discuss about dedicated host within Azure. And in order to explain this, I'm going to take an example of Azure region. As you know that Azure has more than 54 plus region spread all across the globe. So let's say if I want to deploy a virtual machine in one of the Azure region, I will take example of Canada Central and I want to deploy a virtual machine. So I can go to the interface, or I can use the CLI. There are different ways I will deploy the virtual machine, right? If I want to deploy another virtual machine, same way I can deploy one more VM, right? But when I deploying these machines, I don't get any access to the physical hardware. So if I come and deploy this VM1, it can be on a different hardware and the VM2 can be on a different one, right? Because I don't have a control on which node I'm going to deploy this machine. Now, why this is important? Now, you can definitely take advantage of PPG, also known as proximity placement group, which makes sure that geographically within the same region, they are closer to each other. So you get less latency, right? So that's one of the options you can use. But still, there will be some sort of latency because the machines that I'm deploying or the VMs that I'm deploying, they're on separate hardware. Now, what option I have in case I want to make sure that my machines that I'm deploying resides on the same hardware, and that is where the dedicated host will come into play, right? So when we talk about a dedicated host, I have a physical hardware that will be dedicated to me. So this is a host I'm talking about here. And this will be deployed in a host group. And think of a host group as a logical boundary, right? And in this logical boundary, I can deploy multiple hosts. So this can be a host group, and the machine that going to deploy within will be within the same region. So if I'm taking example of Canada Central, my host group will reside within same region, and in this host group I can have multiple hosts. So this, say for example, this is my host one. I can also deploy another host, right? And I can deploy multiple hosts if I want. So all these options are there if I want to deploy and use dedicated hosts. Now, what is the advantage of using dedicated? Now, one of the advantage I can tell you right out of the start is the performance, right? So as I explained you with the example that if I come and deploy as a VM, basically, I don't have control on which node it will be deployed. Yes, I can use proximity placement group, but still there is going to be a distance in terms of, because these data centers are huge, right? And within one region, you can have multiple data centers, and it can be on any of those nodes within that data center. So performance. So if I'm deploying a dedicated host and I'm deploying a virtual machine, it will make sure that those virtual machine basically resides on the same. So I will get, from the latency wise, it will be the least. So I will get definitely a better performance. Another reason I will say is that is the compliance. Now, there are a lot of businesses from the compliance perspective, they are not ready to move to the cloud because they are sharing the data center. So for those customer, and especially the regulated industry, and I'll just take example of Canada, because say for example in Canada we don't have a dedicated gov region like some of the regions in US and even in Europe. So if government or any regulated industry like banking, they want to move, they might not want to share the hardware, because otherwise if I come and deploy the server, my server will be on the same hardware on which the other companies instances are deployed, right? So for those kind of companies where compliance is one of the critical factor in case they're trying to move to the cloud, this will make sure that they're not sharing the underlying hardware. So from compliance perspective, for those kind of companies or those organization, This is a good value too, along with the performance. So definitely it will be helpful and make their journey easy as they are not sharing the underlying hardware. Now, sometimes there is also a question arises now, is this a bare metal deployment, right? Because yes, you have this dedicated hardware. Is this a bare metal? So actually, it's not a bare metal because reason being that yes, that hardware is dedicated for you, but underlining the hypervisor is still Hyper-V, right? Because when it comes to bare metal, otherwise you should get the flexibility of choosing what hypervisor you want, right? There's a different service within Azure if you want to use maybe a VMware or ESXi hypervisor. But in this case, yes, you will deploy the VMs, and it's only your VMs that will be deployed. But still, it's not a bare metal because hypervisor is already provisioned for you. You can come and deploy any number of virtual machine on this, depending upon as long as that host, because every host has a limitation in terms of CPU and RAM, and that's where the types of these will come into play. So when we talk about these dedicated hosts, you can choose from type 1, type 2, and type 3, and these are nothing but a specific kind of compute, so CPU's RAM. Now one thing I just want to point out here is that this has a limitation of what series of machines you'll be able to deploy on these hosts, right? There is a limitation of specific kind of D, E, F, and now recently they have also introduced the N series. As you know, if I go and deploy a VM, otherwise I have a whole list of the VM or the instance sizes that I can deploy. But specifically relating to the dedicated host, there's specific kind of series I can deploy, and I can only deploy within the same series, right? But you will come across type 1, 2, and 3, and I will show you actually on the Azure portal. And but it is nothing but a specific kind of compute that you can associate it with that host. So, but performance and compliance will be the critical factor in case you want to use dedicated host for your deployment. Now, from the pricing perspective, obviously it depends upon what type of host you're using, whether using one, two, or three. But your cost will start applying as soon as you deploy these dedicated hosts. So cost will start the moment you deploy this host, right? It doesn't matter if you have a VM running or not, because as I said that this host is dedicated for you. No other company or organization can come over here and deploy this resources. So as soon as you deploy this dedicated host, your cost will start or the compute cost will start coming up in your monthly bill. So something to be of mindful. So there are two costs associated with this. One will be the compute cost based on the type you use, plus the software cost. And you can use this to deploy both Windows as well as Linux VM. So compute cost, obviously CPU's RAM, and the software cost is uh, what Windows Server licensing you're deploying based on the number of CPUs that you're utilizing or the number of cores that you're utilizing for that specific VM. But in case you have software assurance, you can take advantage of limiting the cost from the licensing perspective. So customers who already have SA, active SA, and they are thinking of moving to or utilizing dedicated hosts, they can bring those licensing and take advantage of software assurance. In that case, you don't need to pay for the licensing, you just pay for the compute basically, right? One way of saving money. Another thing is that if you want to save money, very similar to if you just come and deploy a VM, and you can use RIs, you can use reserve instances, right? So RI can be used even for the dedicated host, and you can use between 1 year or 3 year. So basically, you're telling Microsoft is that I'm here to stay here, and Microsoft is going to incentivize that by giving you discount based on 1 year or 3 year term that you get utilized. So these are some of the ways that you can reduce the cost. by using software assurance in case you already have, and by choosing 1 year, 3 year for reserve instances for your dedicated host. You don't have to start right out of the gates. Say, for example, for this RI, you can just start using dedicated host, and maybe 3, 4 months down the line, whenever you feel comfortable with the technology, you can change it to a reserve instance. But when we talk about dedicated host, you're talking about host group, which is a logical boundary. And in that host group, you will deploy a host, which is nothing but a physical hardware which is dedicated for you. It's still not a bare metal deployment because obviously, as I explained, the hypervisor is already set for you. Now, there is also another question which will come across is that what happens to the high availability, right? Now, the minimum requirement from any HA architecture is that you should have at least two hosts, right? You can deploy multiple hosts, but at least from the high availability is that in case the VM running on this host goes down, you should have at least two hosts, so you can architect in a way that that's load balanced. So minimum requirement for HA is that you should have two dedicated hosts within that host group, right? So this was the theory. So let me just quickly show you on the portal how the experience is. So I'm going to go to the portal. I'm already logged in with my credential, and as I said that the first thing you need to create is a host group. So I'm just going to search for it. And very similar to any deployment, you need to pick your subscription. You need to deploy this in a host group. I already have one. You will name this. Say I want to name this host 1. I'll pick my location. You can deploy this in availability zones. Hopefully you're familiar with availability zones as well as the fault domain. Availability zones is basically segregation of deployment. So a region consists of multiple data center, and if you deploy that within availability zone, it will make sure that your resources are separated or distributed across multiple availability zones. So every zone has its own dedicated power supply, cooling. So in case the whole data center goes down within the region, your services will be still up. You can also specify the fault domain. Basically, it will have a separate power supply and everything. So that's also option available. And you can also have option of automatic host assignment. So in case you want to deploy maybe a virtual machine scale set or something, right, it will automatically deploy that on the available host for you, right? I'm not going to use right now. I can also tag it, and I'm just going to review and create. So deployment was successful. Now I can go to the resource, and you can see that on the left side I get the option of managing this, and I get the option of adding the host. Actually, one thing I forgot to add here is, if I can go back, so other than the performance and the compliance, because you have a dedicated physical host for you, you also get, I will say, much more control how you can manage your machines or your resources on top of this, right? Yes, you get those also option, but you get a little bit more granular level from the update management, how that physical host is updated. So in case there is a scenario in which you cannot even have a second of downtime, basically when the machines are getting updated, so you can specify a window, and because you have this whole physical host assigned to you, you get more control how you want to update this. So something along with performance and compliance, uh, you get that advantage by using dedicated host. So going back, as you can see that I don't have any host right now, it is 0. And adding the host is pretty straightforward. You can just go and click on add host, pick your subscription resource group, right? And you can give whatever name you want for this host, pick your region you want to deploy. And this is where your compute cost will come into play. As I said that there are two costs associated. One is the compute, one is the licensing. This is the compute cost I talked about, and there are different types. You get type 1, type 2, type 3, and they're nothing but combination of CPU and RAM, right? So you can see that D series, E series, we also have now F&M, and recently they've also introduced N series, and there are different types associated. So there should be a planning that needs to be done or should be in place, and Microsoft has documentation explaining what kind of compute power is associated with different types, and based on that, that many machines you will be able to deploy on that node, right? And if I just pick, say for example, type 1, I can pick my fault domain. I can also specify that it automatically replaces the host on failure, so in case the host goes down, another host will be spun up for me. I can disable, I can enable. And this is the other thing. There's a licensing cost in case you have Windows Server or SQL Server licensing and you have the hybrid benefit. You can specify over here, right, that you have. In that case, you won't be charged for those Windows or SQL Server licensing. That's a great way of saving money from the licensing stand. And once you click on review and create, which I'm not going to do because this is a sponsored account that I have, your machine will start deploying, or your host will start deploying, and on that host you can deploy multiple VMs or your servers as long as that is supported on that host, and that many machines you'll be able to deploy. And actually, in the Microsoft documentation, it also talks about, depending upon what type you choose, how many machines you can deploy, because it has a limitation on the CPUs and the RAM associated with that specific dedicated host. So this was a brief overview of a dedicated host within Azure. Hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.